So here I am, outside a pagan church trying to psych myself up to go inside. I have the sort of anxiety that makes it difficult for me to visit new restaurants, let alone dabble in unfamiliar religions. To make matters worse, I've come here alone, not a single friend or loved one to act as a security totem. Just me and my ever-present rotating parade of neuroses searching for answers. I figure I'd better head inside. It's now or never, and I have, as usual, arrived about 4 minutes late. As I enter the multi-purpose room of this Unitarian church, I pass rainbow-colored signs telling me all are welcome here. I plan to sit in the back, quietly observe, and hopefully go largely unnoticed. It's at times like these that I regret dyeing my hair shockingly pink. It's easier to go incognito with my natural mousy brown. But alas, another impulsive decision made when feeling braver than I am today. Upon opening the door, I see there are only 8 other people in the room, plus the 7 on Zoom, and the chairs are arranged in a circle. I do my best to keep my expression neutral and share a forced but polite smile. I hope that no one can read the absolute panic on my face as I realize that I will not be able to fade into the decor. I will need to participate. I worry they may find me a disrespectful interloper. Can they tell I grew up a Christian? That I still am a Christian? That at 11 I was baptized at my family church? Is everyone truly welcome here? I grew up going to the Pittman Road Church of God. I attended Sunday school, vacation Bible school, joined the youth group, and spent a summer at church camp. Your girl was a goody-goody pious princess. My father and grandmother took me to church every other Sunday. I had a community of elders that cared for me as if I were their own, checked on how I was doing in school, praised my crayon artwork, and offered me Jell-O salad and casseroles at many a potluck. I befriended a gaggle of other church children, and we rampaged the halls, screaming, giggling, running past our parents, grandparents, and the pastor as they told us all to be careful and not run inside. Advice I should have taken, as I once slipped in my church tights and smacked my head directly into a glass door. My grandmother would take me to JCPenney every spring to purchase a new Easter jumper. She'd help me pick out patent leather Mary Janes and scold me for pulling on my woolen stockings, which I swore and still do were the itchiest clothing to have ever been invented. What I learned in those years seems simple enough to me. God is love. Jesus is love. Christians must accept that love and share it. No exceptions, no fine print. As I got older and took in more of the world, I could see that message getting more complicated and often outright ignored. The love and peace it once brought me twisted into something I no longer recognized. I stopped going to services, and eventually the Pittman Road Church of God closed, turned into a Baptist house of worship. I couldn't even find my way back to that place if I wanted to. I guess you really can't go home again.
With every next step, it multiplies uncertainty, and every next day could be the last. When every night's breath could be the one that kills you, and every next day could be the last.
The fight in God's name is nothing new. Holy wars have raged all over the globe for centuries. In modern America, we're now able to watch this tussle streaming live in 4K. From your television, from your laptop, from your phone. Never miss a minute of the chaos, even if you'd really like to. The Trump administration has not only created a White House faith office led by televangelist Paula White Cain, as well as an anti-Christian bias task force, they've also appointed conservative evangelicals to many positions of power, including making Arkansas Governor and Southern Baptist minister Mike Huckabee ambassador to Israel. Roe v. Wade was struck down. Trans rights are debated. Gay marriage, though upheld, was brought back to the Supreme Court. ICE swarms cities, disappearing families overnight, and time again we're told, this is God's country, a Christian nation, chosen for greatness by the Lord himself. If you're like me, then the constant feed of tragedy, absurdity, and hypocrisy might have you veering toward nihilism. Perhaps Billy Shakespeare had it right. Hell is empty. All the devils are here. It's hard to root for a country and a species that seem dead set on working against its own best interests. But am I really going to let some megalomaniac take my country and my faith? I think not. Spite is a powerful motivator, though not always the most constructive. So, what can be done? How can we change the ending of this story that we've already read before? I suppose it's time for this out-of-practice Christian to head back to church, and not just the Protestant sanctuary of my youth. I'm Jamie Walsh, and today on the Unwise Podcast, we're going to explore the intersection of faith and politics, and the rise of Christian nationalism.
With every next breath, with every new contaminant, when every next day could be the last, I'm supposed to feel alive, I'm supposed to be productive, I'm supposed to feel alive, I'm supposed to be productive.
As I set out on my journey to try and unravel the complicated web of Christian nationalism, it seemed there was no better place to start than speaking with the man who literally wrote the book on it. For more information on just what makes a Christian nationalist, I turned to Dr. Andrew Whitehead, a sociology professor and executive co-director of the Association of Religion Data Archives at the Center for the Study of Religion and American Culture at the University of Indiana, Indianapolis. He's also the co-author, along with Samuel L. Perry, of the book Taking America Back for God, Christian Nationalism in the United States.
So Sam and I started working together looking at survey data of the American public and researching Christian nationalism back in 2013 or 2014. And so we started publishing a series of peer-reviewed articles in social scientific journals looking at Christian nationalism and different aspects of American political and social life. So how Americans view same-sex marriage or transracial adoption. And as those papers started to come together on what were pretty different topics, it seemed like, looking at gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, views of democracy, we started to realize that there was something deeper going on and that this Christian nationalism angle explained a lot more about Americans' beliefs and values maybe than we realized. So it wasn't just on one topic, but many. And so at that point, then we kind of thought, maybe this needs to come together into a larger argument. And so then I applied for some funding to put Christian nationalism questions on another national survey that formed the backbone of some of the book. But once we had that data, we started writing it and were able to kind of pull together much of what we were finding and create kind of that larger argument about if we want to understand political polarization in America and where people are coming from, we can't ignore the impact of Christian nationalism and this idea that a particular expression of Christianity should be ascendant. Whether you strongly accept that and embrace it or reject it, that tells us a lot about how you see your social world.
Yeah. Could you talk a little bit about the scale sort of that you guys created to determine, what percent basically Christian nationalist supporter the participants were?
Yeah. So when we collected this data, the survey that I was able to put questions on was the Baylor Religion Survey, which was a survey by researchers and sociologists at Baylor University, and they were collecting it every 2 to 3 years or so. And then we also used the General Social Survey, which is collected by the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago. And that's been collected every 2 years since the mid-'70s. And they had a question on some of their surveys, more recent, late 90s and into the 2000s, that essentially asked folks if they thought being Christian was necessary to be a true American, right? So true Americans have to be Christians. And then the Baylor Religion Survey used a series of questions that asked for a level of agreement with statements like the federal government should declare the U.S. a Christian nation, or should advocate Christian values, or we should have prayer in public schools. And so we were able to use essentially these two different measures of this underlying concept. Right. So do people see Christianity as being central to American identity was one way. The other way were with some of these questions. Do they strongly agree with a lot of these? And when we were able to run statistical analyses on those questions, we found that if you strongly agreed with one, you're pretty likely to strongly agree with all, and similar for disagreeing. So it means they hang together statistically. And so we created a scale using those questions where if you answered strongly agree or agree on all those questions, you scored high on the scale. If you disagreed or strongly disagreed with a lot of those, you were low. And what we found is that Americans are pretty equally distributed across that scale. So most folks are somewhere in the middle, but we have a contingent of Americans at the upper end and a contingent at the lower end. And that was kind of where we started with this book, because at this point, nobody really knew how many Americans embraced it strongly or rejected it. Since then, we've had other data collections that I've done or Sam has done or different groups like the Public Religion Research Institute. And we continue to refine the measures of the scale and hopefully drilling in more so on people that really want to see Christianity as central. And so even today, there are some changes from the book as to the size of those that maybe strongly agree or embrace Christian nationalism or those that are more just sympathetic to it. But what we find though is no matter the size differences of these groups, what belonging to one of those groups means and is predictive of and how they see their social worlds has stayed absolutely consistent even since we wrote the book. And so that's been really good to see that while we can figure out kind of relative size of the groups, we know what these groups are all about. So what we find over and over, and there's, dozens of peer-reviewed studies that help illustrate each of these cultural markers of Christian nationalism or the Christianity of Christian nationalism. And one of those cultural markers is a desire for a traditional social hierarchy, right? So when we look at the United States and this desire to see marriage between a man and a woman, and that they should really try to have kids and a lot of kids, biological kids of their own, and that there are two genders and that is it. It's, one or the other. So seeing this kind of traditional understanding of gender and sexuality as ordering society, that we have people at the top, in the middle, and at the bottom. And those at the top that have easiest access to civil rights and benefits are those that align with these traditional understandings of gender and sexuality. So we have that part. And so, again, we're looking at some of the things happening. The Supreme Court actually, refused to revisit the Kim Davis, the county clerk in Kentucky, who refused to give out marriage certificates. They refused to relitigate that case. At least in this instance, it's not as though they'll be revisiting same-sex marriage legality. But those on the right were pushing for that right now, right? And so that's kind of one example of that cultural marker, this traditionalist social hierarchy. And then we have another cultural marker of, strong ethno-racial boundaries around American identity. And so, there are a lot of examples of this. A lot of it comes into how folks of minority racial and ethnic groups are treated. So if we're looking at, in the military, who should be allowed to be in and participate. There's different things that the Secretary of Defense is kind of pushing forward that people are like, this actually really kind of makes it seem like he really only wants white Americans to be in the military. When we look at immigration policies, and there's so much of that happening right now, folks that are here, if they don't have white skin, generally, they're kind of coded as probably less than or not American. And so much is happening in that sense. And we see ICE or the Department of Homeland Security using Christian scripture in these training videos or these videos they're trying to draw people in to become part of the organization. And so they're again using this kind of brand of Christianity to say, this is what it means to be American. And it really does line up with these ethno-racial boundary lines of, we're a white Christian nation that was created. And then we also see this kind of desire for capitalist values, right, as central. So in the economy, it's all about kind of neoliberalism of this is a meritocracy. If you work hard, you're going to be fine. And those that don't work hard probably will be left behind. But it's a free society, and we need to really open up any sort of rules and regulations so that this free market capitalism can be ascendant. And we see, again, a lot of at least the rhetoric coming from the administration around that. What's interesting is some of the choices they're making are actually against free market capitalism. And so it doesn't actually line up some with what they're doing, but the rhetoric and idea is there. And so that's also a part of this understanding of a Christian nation is it's all about capitalism and, keeping away from communism or especially socialism. Anything that might serve everyone is viewed with a lot of skepticism. And then we also see, tying all those together, a comfort with authoritarian social control. This is another cultural marker of the Christianity of Christian nationalism. It's this idea that the world is chaotic and it's spinning out of control. And so we need strong rules and we need a strong ruler, especially to come in and enforce that order. the traditional social hierarchy, the strong ethno-racial boundaries, this economic system. We need to have somebody come in and really say, this is how it's going to be. And so Americans who embrace Christian nationalism are more supportive of this idea that we need somebody to come in and fix the place. We need perhaps even political violence to ensure that we get America back on track. And so there's a real kind of skepticism of democracy and compromise. And so that kind of binds those together. And then finally, the last cultural marker is this kind of view of populism, that America is made for the common man and woman, and that there's these shadowy elites in academia or religion or in politics who are stealing it away. And so we need to push back against those forces. And that kind of relates to this idea of an authoritarian figure coming in and forcing order because they'll fight for us. But it leads to a lot more conspiratorial thinking and feeling persecuted, that they're coming after us and they're taking away what we have. Like this idea of, if we aren't privileged, then we're being discriminated against.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And so when you're used to privilege, even equality feels like discrimination. And so that's where these folks feel that persecution, more conspiratorial thinking, and then wanting to unwind some of the guardrails of democracy. And so those five things, which I know is a lot, but those five cultural markers are really what we're talking about when we're talking about the Christianity of Christian nationalism. It isn't just this idea of the historic Christian faith of, the Trinity and Jesus and what Jesus did on the cross and all those things. It includes that, but it brings with it this cultural baggage. And it's that cultural baggage that really makes the Christian nationalism of Christianity in the US what it is.
Now, I know there are a number of Christians who view their faith as a set of moral guidelines and use the Bible as an instruction manual for how to be a good human being. And to some extent, I agree. But I'm not what one would call a Bible literalist. I have always believed that the stories are more about what they mean rather than what they are. In short, the world is not black and white. There's a lot of gray. So, what if we removed the religious aspect? Would humans simply devolve into anarchy? Or is it possible to be secular and still fight for good, for peace, for progress? These musings led me to Kansas City Oasis, whose website identifies them as a secular community of compassion and reason celebrating the human experience. Founded in Houston in 2012 by former pastor Mike Oss, Oasis was designed to provide a non-religious, community-focused alternative to church. I spoke with Julie Samuel Lambert, a member of the board of directors for Kansas City Oasis, who told me more about their values and what drew her to the group.
We're here not only to educate people about secular humanism and sort of what it is and what it isn't, but primarily what we hope to achieve is to build that ability for people to enjoy the human experience by sharing it with other people. It can be really lonely being a person, especially if you've moved to a big city, don't know anybody. A lot of times people's lives were organized around the religion they were raised in or various other groups they were part of. But we're really here just to provide that sense of community, regardless of all that. We don't have any theological beliefs, as the secular point, sort of points out, that we don't have any beliefs in the sense that everyone is expected to think the same way. But we do have some core values that we share and espouse and sort of guides how we act around each other. And those are that people are more important than beliefs, that human hands solve human problems, that meaning comes from making a difference, and reality is known through reason. And I think most importantly for all of us, I think the one we feel the most is to be accepting and be accepted.
Yeah. Well, because I also saw on there that I was reading through the website that it's not just for like atheists. People might think that it's just for, there are people of faith who come to this as well.
Right. Yeah. We do have people that are atheists. We have people that identify as agnostic. Maybe some that just were not raised with any religious tradition at all, but don't espouse to being either one of those. But we have people that describe themselves as spiritual, but not religious. Or we have practicing Buddhists are part of our community, as well as people that are Christians. And we even partner with some Christian organizations to carry out some of our philanthropy, some of
Hmm.
the part where I talk about human hands solve human
Yeah.
problems. We feel like, we can multiply the ability of other groups to get some positive work for our community done. So I would not say we are an anti-religious organization. There's just an absence of religious connotation in what we do when we're together. And I think that makes it so that everybody can feel comfortable there. It's not exclusionary in that regard. And we're not saying that if you are a Christian and just, want to try something different or learn about one of the topics, because we do have educational programming weekly, that you're not going to be uncomfortable around us. You're not going to feel like you're not welcome there because it goes back to that whole people are more important than beliefs piece of our shared values.
Yeah. And it does seem like there's a focus on community. So if you were maybe once part of a church or aren't anymore and you're sort of missing that community and that group spirit and that want to do good,
Right.
that you can do this without any expectations of what exactly your behavior and belief system should be. It's sort of just like come, do good, learn, be with people, join something
Right.
without heavy expectations of how you must rigidly live your life.
Yeah, it's a very obligation-free sort of
Yeah.
community that we're part of. We are so happy to see you when you're there, but you're not going to have, a phone call from somebody. If we don't see you for a week or if we don't see you for a year or 5 years, we're still going to be there. We're still going to be just as happy to see you whenever you can make time to share that time with us.
And I saw that this isn't the only oasis. They're in Texas, Utah, Ontario. I noticed that there's a lot in Utah, which my mind
Yeah.
wonders if that might have anything to do with Mormonism also in Utah and people finding an alternative to that, but I have no
Yeah.
proof. So,
No, I think I probably do have some anecdotal evidence
yeah.
of that at least. And here in the Midwest, and I would say Texas as well, that, being someone that does not subscribe to a particular religion can also be a lonely experience.
Yeah.
I think you feel like sometimes you have to be a little guarded in that regard because you're not sure if you're in a heavily religious great era community, that if you don't have a place where you fit in that religious vein, that there is going to be a challenge if you're vocal about that. There is some reasons why these exist in the Midwest
Yeah.
and in Utah, Texas, places that are heavily religious.
Yeah.
And it was founded, there were co-founders, one here in Kansas City and one in Houston, Texas. So those were the, very religious sorts of places.
Yeah.
But the two founders, kind of worked on this idea together, thought about, what we're really trying to do and being intentional on how we do it. We've also just recently been able to have a chapter of a group called Recovering from Religion that meets in our building. They're also a 501c3, but we just provide space for them. And what they do is really help those people that have, beyond just being non-religious or not being raised in a faith-based tradition, have maybe had religious trauma of one kind or another, whether it's rejection from their families because they're non-religious or because they're part of the LGBTQIA plus community. There's various reasons that people have felt damage
Yeah.
from religion. I come from a fundamentalist, high control religion myself. I was not raised to think that I, as a woman, should be the leader of anything. And so that has sort of been unique with my role at Kansas City Oasis, I think, and sort of what drew me to it originally is that I saw that women were valued and given positions of authority and leadership, and made me understand that there's kind of a different way of doing things than the way I was raised with. And I want to be able to provide that for other women that, maybe were in the shoes that I was 20 years ago.
Yeah.
Part of my struggle, and I think what I hope to give back to the world, is I really had to find a sense of identity because I was the fifth generation in my family to be part of this
Mm.
very high control religion. And, when I left that, I really struggled with who I am. Who am I? What do I think about things? Because those weren't questions I could ask, right? I was submissive to my father and followed by my husband shortly thereafter. I was not very old. I was just 18 when I got married. And as I was learning who I was without being in that mold, it gave me time to kind of think of like, what do I want to do? And so I got the opportunity. I had some really great mentors along the line, and they were like, what have you always wanted to do that you didn't get to do? And I said, well, I never really had the opportunity to pursue college education. So that was one thing I did. And man, that just opened up a whole world of different thoughts and ideas. And I think going back to our programming, I mean, that's something that we, in a different kind of way, seek to
Yeah.
do. Like, did you know that Kansas City, did you know there was an FBI shootout at Union Station? And that was sort of where the FBI started. I mean, just various things on all kinds of topics
Yeah.
because, just even in a city not that big, Kansas City's not the biggest city in the world, of course, but there's still a lot of really interesting people and ways that people have lived their lives that might be outside our experience if we just stay in our own little bubble. So we seek to kind of just try to broaden everybody's access and I guess ability to hearing different perspectives or different things that are going on. That's really important. Christian nationalism wants us to be homogenized. And that's something I say, if I'm hosting an Oasis and something lends itself to it, it's something I like to say, like, we don't come here to be homogenized. We come here because it's a place we can be ourselves. And I think why movements like that pick up steam is it's so much easier to go along to get along. Even if it doesn't really suit who you are, like in the core of your person, it's easier just to say, oh, yeah, okay, yeah, no, that's right. We can, yeah, if we just all do the same thing, be the same thing, look the same way, love the same way, love the same people that are just like us, that's the right way to be. But man, just think about how much you miss out on when you see the world like that. I mean, I understand. I've lived that way.
Yeah.
I lived that way until I was in my 30s. And I completely understand what it's like and then what I missed out on for not letting those other kinds of people that don't look just like me or even just think like me, missing out on all those perspectives. It's sad to me, really, in hindsight, because I've done both things. Me personally, I've done it both ways. I've lived life both ways. And there's no way I would want to go back to having that feeling that the only way I'm a good person or the only way that I'm an acceptable person is if I'm exactly like everybody else. Because we lose as people and as a country, we just lose so much if we see the world as so black and white like that. And I feel a lot of sympathy for those people because I know it's hard. I know personally know how hard it is to break out of that and decide to do something different for yourself. And I think people are just not students of history either. Like it's been time after time we've seen what Christian nationalism leads to, the othering of people that are different. And that leads to, those other people being the scapegoats for all the problems that are happening. And it's just a slippery slope to a place that I don't think that anybody really wants to be. But I think it's easy to have that happen if you're not paying attention and not being vigilant to what that sort of like everybody's the same or nothing sort of thinking leads to.
In my church growing up, I have to admit, we were all remarkably similar. We read the same King James Version. We were largely all Midwestern, white, and middle to lower middle class. It's easy to feel comfortable when you blend in. It's the standing out that's hard. Is there room in the Christian faith for those who don't so rigidly adhere to the standard mold? For these theological questions, I reached out to Dr. Jason Oliver Evans, an ordained Baptist minister and a postdoctoral teaching fellow at Princeton Theological Seminary, whose areas of interest and research include Black and womanist theologies, queer theologies, liberation, post-colonial and decolonial theologies, and many more.
I was raised in a family of African American Baptists in the city and around the city of Philadelphia. I am fourth generation ordained Baptist minister, but it took a while to get to that point. For me, although raised within a family of Christians, I struggled with my Christian identity as my burgeoning queer identity was emerging, but I really didn't have language for it. I knew my family assumed that homosexuality was sinful, but they didn't really talk about it openly. Most of the conversations, or at least the ideas about homosexuality being sinful, I learned through religious television. And so growing up in the heyday of Trinity Broadcasting Network or Daystar or the Word Network, hearing certain televangelists openly condemn homosexuality. And so my family was generally conservative, even though they didn't identify as evangelicals. They were not evangelicals at all. Evangelical meant white. I was raised in a denomination, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, as well as the National Baptist Convention, which are predominantly African American Baptist denominations. So we had no immediate connections with white evangelicalism whatsoever. But when it came to their sexual ethics, I mean, on paper,
Yeah.
it was pretty much conservative. Now, in practice, that's a whole different story.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so when it came to teenage years, I mean, that was really much a trial all throughout, just struggling alone silently, not really trusting anyone to share what I'm feeling, how I'm feeling. So I relied on books. And then when I started college, of course, that gave me more access to a lot of different resources, but I was still pretty much evangelical minded, for lack of a better word, even though I'm struggling with my sexuality. So depression, anxiety, all these other things. So interestingly enough, I was very active in the Christian community on campus at my alma mater, and I sensed a call at the age of 22 Christian ministry, which was a very interesting experience. Although I'm like, yes, Lord, I'm definitely going to follow your will and way. I'm like, what about this gay thing?
Yeah.
You called the gay one. I'm like, out of all the children, you could have just picked the other ones. I love the study of theology. It is truly a passion of mine, especially in this time. I feel very much a sense of urgency to, and this may be paradoxical, to slow down and to think the faith, to think through. Because in this social, political, religious moment, of course, American Christianity is on steep decline and throughout various sectors. And we have this rise of course, generations of nuns, spiritual but not religious. We also have folks who are defecting from evangelicalism of various forms, faith deconstruction, all this stuff. And while there is room for folks to deconstruct, there needs to be much more capacious conversation in the American public discourse about reconstructing one's faith and offering resources for doing that. And I feel like my work will contribute to folks reconstructing, because faith deconstruction is not necessarily the pursuit of theological understanding. It's just simply raising questions about the stuff that you were taught and questioning everything and challenging, which is good, but it's not to be equated with theological understanding. I think theology is definitely the pursuit of answers, whereas faith deconstruction is more about exhibiting the freedom to ask questions, which in various traditions were considered like anathema,
Yeah.
so to speak.
Definitely, as history moves forward and the political climate changes, that affects the churches too. I'm mostly focusing right now on how the churches affect politics, but the politics are also influencing
Yes.
the religion as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because we have to understand that religions are cultural phenomena and they are political phenomena. We have to understand that, I'm just going to put it bluntly, the separation of church and state, although it is a noble endeavor, it's never been reality. And quite frankly, even the idea of a secular thing, it comes out of a religious consciousness.
Yeah.
And I think for African Americans in particular, this idea of separation of church and state was just like, that was cute. Because the reality of the matter is, for African Americans, Christians particularly, is that our political involvement in this culture has been catalyzed through religious traditions. I mean, NAACP was probably the first secular, made well-known, quote unquote, secular movement or organization for involvement. But we didn't rely on NAACP just solely like to say, okay, we don't have to appeal to our churches anymore in order to fight for us. Because the reality of the matter is a lot of people who were in the NAACP were Christian. Now, W.E.B. Du Bois was like, his Christianity, he had an interesting relationship with religion. But all this to say, I mean, religion and politics have never been separated. And this idea to suggest that they must be, quote unquote, separated, people don't understand that secular the idea, the culture, it's a religious idea at its root. And to make religion a private matter is a very modern notion that fails to understand religions as particular cultural, political phenomena. Like this whole, well, I don't wear my religion on my sleeve. That's cute, but that's the very that's a very very Western notion.
Yeah.
Two, let me speak as a Christian because I think that's the problem. Because I think in America, when people are fighting religion, what they're really fighting is a particular iteration of Christianity. There are theorists of religion who speak in very globalizing terms, and I respect that because they have their own reasons for doing that. I will speak when it comes to Christian traditions. Christianity is a cultural phenomenon in America that cannot be simply disentangled from political discourse or cultural discourse. It is literally embedded in our culture. As basic as you have atheists be saying, oh my God, like it's part of our cultural zeitgeist.
Yeah.
Also, Christianity as a religious cultural phenomena, the very logics of the golden rule, if you will, like do unto others you would have them do unto you. I mean, there are people who love to extract that from this particular religious roots. And because it also shows up in various other religious traditions, of course, Christianity is very tied to Judaism. So we have a cultural root where this comes out of. And so you want to make that a universalizing principle and says we can just extract this out of and we don't really need all this religious baggage. That's a farce. For me, in my opinion, it's a farce. And I say this to say we need to actually be more critical and more rigorous about how religious ideas shape politics and how politics shape religion. Because in white Christian nationalism, and this is one of the things I wanted to say, I think for me, one of the consequences of folks leaving Christianity is that you leave Christianity to these crazies. Like, they get to define what Christianity is. And for me, as a theologian who's invested as a Christian in the Christian tradition, I refuse to see Christianity to white Christian nationalists and white supremacists. Because what they're doing, for me, theologically, is completely idolatry. It's absurd. It's antichrist. It's heretical. It's all the bad things that, I can invoke as a Christian theologian. And yet, for most people, and this is another consequence of what it means for Christianity to be a cultural phenomenon, despite its diversity, people who are not religious or people who are, post-Christian or people who are like literally one door out of the church, they don't care about the diversity. They care that this is the church.
Yeah.
They don't care about churches. They don't care about denominations. They don't care about traditions. They don't care about, insofar as you call yourself a Christian, we're all lumped in. No matter how many times I say, well, that's not my Christianity, that's not my Jesus. Even if I were to see the term Christian, like I no longer identify as Christian, I just follow Christ, I don't escape the reality of, insofar as you bear the name Christ or you claim to follow Jesus of Nazareth, you're linked with white Christian nationalists, whether we like it or not. So for me, I have the greater responsibility as a theologian, as a minister, as an educator, to articulate a Christian vision that somehow refutes the logics of white Christian nationalism. So that the bearing of responsibility is on those of us who still remain or travel under this sign, whether we like it or not. Because even if I were to say, I'm a Christ follower, you still have to give an account of what makes that different from them, because they claim to follow Jesus too.
Yeah.
So the reactionary impulse of many well-meaning Christians who are progressive, but they still want to say they're Christian or just want to follow Jesus, that actually, the ball is in our court to actually give a more robust account of what does it mean to follow Jesus in this time, in the rise of white Christian nationalism. Because what we see here and what they're saying here, if you're saying that's not the way of Jesus, so tell the people what is.
What would Jesus do? If you grew up in any sort of Christian church, you likely sported a WWJD tote bag or coffee mug, emblazoned those letters on your youth group workbook, or arranged them in decorative beads for your handmade jewelry of choice. WWJD is the old standby of any Christian bookstore and gift shop, but I'm not sure that we really spend enough time focusing on why that trendy little acronym actually matters. Be honest. When I say Quaker, do you think of oats? Or perhaps you remember your elementary school class reading a chapter about this pacifist religion existing in the early colonies. Just so we're clear, Quakers have no ties with the oat manufacturer. In fact, their image was stolen and used because the founders of the company wanted their brand associated with the pure Quaker reputation. Founded in England by George Fox in the mid-17th century, Quakers follow the principle that Christ has come to teach his people himself, stressing direct relations with God through Jesus Christ and the universal priesthood of all believers, an idea that challenges the patriarchal and hierarchical structures of Christian nationalism. For more about the Quaker belief system, I spoke with Jack Nemeth of Kansas City Quakers, Penn Valley Friends.
To give context, Quakers are, especially within our current congregation at Penn Valley, extremely diverse theologically. We have folks who come from various types of Christian and non-Christian backgrounds in Modern Friends meetings. Some people don't even really use any Christian language to describe themselves. So just have to make that kind of header at the start that Modern Friends, particularly in what we call unprogrammed Friends meetings, the ones where we worship in silence, we don't engage in rituals, there's no baptism, communion, those kind of traditional Christian trappings. In that kind of setting, you're going to see a ton of theological diversity. But historically, going back for the past 400 years that Quakers have been around, since roughly the mid-17th century in England, Quakers have always been a group that, in its own telling, is trying to revive a form of primitive Christianity that it sees as having been lost or downplayed over the development of many centuries and millennia of very rigid hierarchical structures. So you see that in a lot of the theology as well as a lot of the social views of Quakers. So, for instance, we don't have priests in our congregation who are coming at us with a reading and a homily and telling us what to think and forgiving our sins and whatever else. We just worship in silence till somebody wants to speak up when they feel led by the Holy Spirit. So in a sense, we're all the priests rather than there just being, a leader of sorts of the congregation, the rest of us just sitting there to listen. It also goes back to, again, there's no formal roles within the congregation. We meet once a month to kind of discuss our own, what we call our business meeting, essentially on the first Sunday of the month, where we arrange the affairs of the congregation. Everybody gets a say, gets to voice their opinions, their opposition, all of that. So hyper egalitarian, which kind of shows itself also in I'm sure some of the historical stuff you've read about. Quakers tended to be a little ahead of the curve on issues like abolition of slavery, women's suffrage, women's equality, more recently issues involving LGBT rights, stuff along those lines. Not to say that Friends weren't also flawed in many ways on those points, but the egalitarian ethos kind of gets a lot of shape in those sort of social views. Friends are also very simplistic materially, do not dress very fancy. We don't have a very fancy house of worship. We literally just worship in a house, a meeting house, instead of a formal church. It's not going to be adorned. You're not going to see fancy paintings or icons or statues in there. Friends are going to greatly emphasize peace and solving problems at a local level, at a societal level, via nonviolent means. Friends are very big on stewardship, on the idea that we have obligations toward our society and toward our planet. We view it as essentially, this is our gift from God that we must manage responsibly. It's not something that we can just recklessly exploit without any concern for the long-term impact. So that's a long-winded answer, but I don't think it's very simple to describe any denomination, given that Christianity has so many and they're all so slightly different. Yeah. But if I had to describe it in short, Friends are egalitarian, anti-hierarchical, simplistic stewards, and in a sense, activists of justice toward all, which has made us quite active in a lot of these sorts of discussions through the centuries and made us plenty of friends and probably a lot of enemies as well. And there's no sense of exclusivity when it comes to Quakerism. We're not going to find Quakers who say that we're the true church and everybody else is wrong, and you should leave your faith background and join us, although you're more than welcome to visit, and if you want to stick around, stick around. It really is an emphasis on bettering yourself as an individual, bettering the community through that kind of utilization of your own talents. The optimistic reading of Quakerism that I have kind of attached myself to is that it takes some of the underlying doctrines of kind of Christian social teaching and I think applies them a little more seriously. So if you believe that everybody is worthy of love and compassion and generosity, why wouldn't you throw yourself into work to try to make that reflected in public policy? If you believe you're supposed to be a steward of the earth, then it makes sense that you're going to be mindful of your own impact on the environment and you're going to push for more pro-environmental legislation. If you're aware that different groups have gotten a raw deal in society and are getting a raw deal in society, it makes sense that you would then support more egalitarian civil rights legislation. So my personal reading has always been that it follows a lot of those precepts that a lot of Christian denominations already believe and just follows them to their natural conclusion, which is we should live simply and treat each other all as equals and try to pay special attention to those who aren't being treated very well by modern society. And of course, Quakers come up short on this, just like any other group. That's sort of the ideal, as I understand it, that Quakers are striving for.
Yeah, there does seem to be an emphasis on social action and sort of getting involved in making your community better. When I looked back on it, we've got Eric Baker, who was a prominent Quaker, was one of the founders of Amnesty International and the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament. Irving and Dorothy Stowe, who co-founded Greenpeace with other environmental activists. They were also Quakers. And then you've got the women's suffrage movement in the U.S. is considered to date from the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls. And I read that that meeting was instigated by 5 women who had been closely involved in the abolition of slavery, and all but one of whom were Quakers. So there is just even traditionally this history of getting involved in sort of social change. And when thinking about that and sort of the ways that Christian nationalist policies are affecting the United States now, what do you think sort of the Quaker role is in working against those policies and seeking to help with issues that our country is facing right now?
Well, I could go a couple directions with this, but it really comes down to a couple of simple rules of thumb. Quaker theology boils down to the idea that we all have that of God within us, that we're all carriers of that Holy Spirit, and therefore we're all obligated to care for one another, look after one another, to recognize what is sacred about each other. So any public policy that denies the dignity of any individual human being, it's going to run up against what Quakers tend to believe. You can also just use the golden rule on this. So that's the way I try to view it. I try to view it as how do we create a fairer society in which the dignity of all individuals is upheld. Because Quakers are so small, at least at the local level with Penn Valley, which is the bulk of my experience with organized Quakerism, you're not going to see a ton of massive, explicitly Quaker-led drives toward influencing public policy, but you will meet a lot of Quaker individuals who are engaged in various causes. So like, for instance, some of them were headline type protests. We've had plenty of Quakers who've gone to the No Kings protest. We've had plenty go to, protests at the Honeywell plant because Quakers tend to oppose things like nuclear weapons and more at large. Of course, it's a pacifist branch of Christianity. But on a finer level, I'm a social worker. We have another friend at our congregation who teaches urban planning with an eye toward sustainable urban development and transportation policies and all of that. We have others who work in healthcare. We have others who used to lobby governments on behalf of various Quaker-friendly political causes. So, you can look at the big issues and say, okay, we're for basic civil rights being extended to everyone. We're for sustainable climate policy. We're for foreign policy that is striving for ultimately what we call an end to war and the causes of war. So, You'd certainly see Quakers generally supporting things like a ceasefire in Gaza, a ceasefire in Ukraine, while also trying to address the underlying causes of those conflicts so they don't start up again. But on a more granular level, I mean, Quakers will fight for local infrastructure projects that are supporting things like sustainable transportation. Quakers would certainly support more housing developments, especially kind of lower income housing developments. You're not going to see them blocking that kind of stuff. But it's not like Quakers just give broad platitudes about peace and justice and happiness and then we go on our way. I think Quakers are pretty remarkably well educated, if I may say so, just from the friends I've met. And there's a lot of policy wonks in there who will support all kinds of things from urban planning to welfare policy to climate change, economics to whatever else. So if you find any kind of fight in the modern United States where the dignity of individuals, the right of individuals to have secure access to healthcare, affordable housing, decent wages, decent education, a livable climate, equal opportunity to get ahead in life or get a fair shot at a successful life, I think you'll find plenty of Quakers in the weeds fighting for those little microeconomic policies to try to make it happen.
For many years, I hardly mentioned my own faith, out of fear that I would be associated with those committing acts of hate and violence in the name of my God. But hopefully, what we're all seeing by now is that Christianity runs a gamut of beliefs and ideologies, and that having faith does not automatically make you a far-right conservative, something Andrew Whitehead confirmed in the survey data for his book, Taking America Back for God.
If all we're kind of talking about is this idea of, religious Americans, that is kind of coterminous with Christian nationalism. If you're one, then you're the other. And what we're able to show with the data is that it's not necessarily true, because while a lot of folks who strongly embrace Christian nationalism also attend church a lot, in fact, they're really religious, those that reject Christian nationalism but also attend church a lot, if we didn't account for Christian nationalism, we might think that religious service attendance makes you, embrace all these beliefs, right? But once we control for, as we talk about, once we account for how strongly you embrace Christian nationalism, the level to which you attend church really doesn't tell us anything about how you might see the social world. In fact, those that attend church a lot but reject Christian nationalism, they tend to be much more pro-social in a lot of their views. And so there's nothing about attendance in and of itself, and this isn't necessarily groundbreaking, but where you're attending and the people that you're with and those contexts that you're in, that's what we're really trying to show. So it's not just about, people who attend church more often, are anti-immigrant, but really it's the Christian nationalism. It's that cultural framework that a lot of folks who do attend a lot embrace. That's what's doing the kind of heavy lifting here and pushing them in this direction.
Yeah. What do you think it is about Trump, especially, that seems to mobilize or empower a lot of Christian nationalists, or what it is that's gained their support, given that most of his outward behaviors would seem, at least on a surface level, to be so anti-Christian?
Yeah, I think this really actually points to the central kind of argument that we're making, that Christian nationalism brings with it this extra cultural baggage that sets it apart from, or is added on to, Christianity. Because what folks who embrace Christian nationalism are looking for is somebody who will put them first and provide them power and access to power and self-interested power. They want to be and ensure that their group is taken care of. And so Donald Trump, it doesn't matter who the leader is personally, if the leader provides them that access and fights for them, quote unquote, then they will gladly throw their support behind them. And so this is what we see with Trump, that he's willing to give them access to power and do what they want and allow them to push for making this country and its policies and identity align with their vision over and against the vision of other Americans or even other people who are Christian. So it isn't about compromise or working together or finding a shared path forward or embracing diversity or pluralism or anything, It's really about what they want the country to look like. And so for Trump, it doesn't matter personally what he looks like as long as he provides them access to power, then they're in. And so in the book I wrote that followed up Taking America Back for God, American Idolatry, I write about how the central idol of Christian nationalism, and I'm kind of writing to Christians, is power and self-interested power. It's a desire to be able to make the world in your group's own image. And so when you have that power, then you fear anybody who might take it away. And then that results in violence, which we're seeing today. And so, yeah, the desire for power is central. And Trump provides that in spades. And so they will follow.
After roughly 6,000 years of recorded human history, isn't the continued pursuit of unlimited power such a cliched motivation? Like, get a hobby, take a walk, listen to a podcast, anything other than tyranny. Now, I bet you're wondering about that pagan church from the beginning of the episode. Before Christianity stormed onto the scene, there was paganism, and many different types. Druidry, Wicca, Kemetic, Celtic, the list goes on and on. A diverse belief system honoring a host of deities, it was certainly far outside anything that was taught or even acknowledged in the religious studies of my youth. But when I entered Gaia Community, a pagan, earth-centered Unitarian Universalist church in Kansas City, I was greeted with nothing but friendly and warm welcomes as they shared with me their ritual. It's an experience I'm truly grateful to have taken part in. I'm also grateful that when I revealed to them I was there for my podcast, they didn't take umbrage to that, and instead, Susie Matthews and Karis Boukalos, who we'll hear from first, agreed to speak with me and explain some of their practices.
My elevator pitch version of a definition of paganism, and there is no universal definition. It's a movement, not an organization. So there is no hierarchy, authority. There's no one policing what is and isn't paganism. We like it that way.
Yeah.
But paganism broadly is spiritual reverence for nature and or spiritual practices derived from mostly pre-Christian indigenous polytheistic religions of Europe and to some degree also the Mediterranean. So like Egyptian is North African, but it was syncretized with Greek religion in some very strong ways after Alexander the Great installed the Ptolemies. And so that cultural exchange and crossover really kept it in touch with Europe in some ways. And so most people who are practitioners of Kemeticism, which is ancient Egyptian pagan religion, usually consider themselves to be under the modern pagan umbrella.
It's interesting. The two of us are probably at kind of bookends of practice. I'm a humanist. I'm a kitchen witch. I'm an artist. I'm a seamstress. So all of my crafts and all of the things that I do are imbued with energy. I view it as nature is sacred to me. I am not a person who specifically looks to any god or goddess. I view it all as energy. And the gods and goddesses for me embody the different aspects of different qualities. That's how I basically view the world. Everything that I try to do consciously and put the kind of energy I want to have out in the world in it. Very much hands-on. I don't have a lot of the knowledge that a lot of the other people have. I do my research, but I am probably more instinctual than anything else.
That's what I liked. You mentioned that you guys are sort of at opposite ends maybe of the spectrum, is that how diverse the community at Gaia seem to be in belief systems and structures, as opposed to, a typical Christian church where everyone is like, this is what we all believe. The story is exactly the same, and we will do it all exactly the same. So I was sort of intrigued by that diversity in belief. I also noticed, since I went to one of the rituals a couple of weeks ago, what you mentioned about energy, just the way at the beginning everyone sort of went around and like, what are you holding on to? How are you feeling? What's been going on in your life? And then sort of that connection to want to summon that good energy or positive energy or energy for change, maybe. So there was a real focus on energy.
A lot of what combines us is the desire for social justice and how we work at that consciously. If there are two things that identify all of us, it's the love of nature and wanting to make things better.
Yeah, that's what I sort of read in
That's
your mission statement on the website. That's sort of what unifies you, even if you come from a diverse background of beliefs.
yeah.
Have you faced any particular challenges as a pagan? Have you run into any misconceptions?
I think we all do to some degree. Probably me less than a lot of the others because I'm a sort of I look like everybody's grandma. I appear to be white. I had a little girl ask me about, I was wearing a piece of jewelry, and she asked me what it meant. And I looked up at her mom and I got her approval for describing it. And I told her that each point referred to a different direction, including spirit and also the different elements. And I asked her if she knew what the elements were, and I kind of guided her toward it a little bit. And her mother looked surprised and kind of like, oh, but she wasn't being judgmental. The little girl was curious. I answered the little girl. The mother was happy with it. We smiled at each other, and that was it. The way I do things is so that other people will say, oh, she's a pagan. Well, maybe it's not so bad.
I mean, I've occasionally run into things, and less so here in a major metropolitan area than for a few years I lived out in central Nebraska, which was a culture shock for me. In major metro areas, people are used to running into people who are different from them. And that was not as true out in rural areas. And so they would be very surprised if I were wearing a pentacle. And they'd be like, I didn't know you were Jewish. Because
You're like, not
they
not
didn't
quite, you
even
guys.
have a
Yeah.
context to put it in. They didn't even have enough exposure to diversity to understand that there are different kinds of stars people might wear around their neck. So it can be different depending on where you are and who you're running into and what assumptions and knowledge base they're coming from. And like people sometimes ask us whether or not Gaia community has had protesters or threats for being an openly pagan congregation. And I don't think we ever have. There were a few
Yeah,
years where, like I said, I was in central Nebraska, and Susie, you were around for then.
yeah, we
Um,
had one guy who listened and then he wanted to preach at us. And we listened for a little while and we finally, I think David finally said, look, we're going to have to agree to disagree and we'll just leave it at that. And he left. I lived for almost a decade just south of Tulsa, and I did not discuss with anybody what my spirituality was. It was not safe.
it's fairly common in the pagan community, like in the queer community, that we have to be aware of how safe it is to be out when we're in a situation in public. And it's not as true as it used to be, but for a long time, a lot of pagans would stay in the broom closet
Yeah.
and not be public about it, not flag by wearing jewelry or getting tattoos in publicly viewable places or things like that, because they just didn't want to deal with harassment or misunderstandings or losing their jobs or losing a custody case or things like that.
Yeah. Given the rise of Christian nationalism and some of the policies that the current administration is putting into place, what are your thoughts on that, and how do you see it affecting the community around you?
My thoughts are a lot of cuss words. I don't put up with any crap at all online, or if someone is abusing one of my people that I view as being under my protection, No holds barred. No holds barred. But I'm old enough I can get away with that because older women are largely invisible. And if they want to think I'm evil, I don't bother me any.
I think that anybody in the pagan community and at Gaia community who's keeping an eye on politics, and that's pretty much everybody at Gaia community, we're broadly speaking, we're keeping an eye on what's going on in the world, what's going on with local politics, national politics, in a way that is pretty common among Unitarian Universalist churches, but is not necessarily as true in the broader pagan community. There are plenty of people in the pagan community who don't pay much attention to politics. I sort of think that it would be better if they did, but people are going to be interested in what they're interested in. But I think that a lot of people are afraid and a
Yeah.
lot of people are angry. We're seeing rights being taken away. We're seeing the Overton window of what is normal and acceptable shifting towards a radical right wing and away from very far away from centrism, let alone the left end of things where most of us pretty comfortably sit. And we also, a lot of pagans tend to be scholars of history to some degree or another. If we're interested in ancient Greek religion, we're probably also learning about ancient Greek history, the rise and fall of empires. We're interested in what happened to the Romans because those gods were continuing on. And the Romans have all of this history of rise and fall of emperors and such. And so we tend to have more history nerds in the pagan community. And anybody who has some breadth or depth of knowledge of history is looking at this going, ooh, this rhymes with what was happening in Weimar Germany. And that's bad, especially with what's happening to the trans community, because that's what happened in Weimar Germany was Hirschfeld's Institute for Understanding of Alternative Sexuality was one of the first things targeted. The book burnings that you see, Nazis burned books and burning books is bad. These specific books they were burning were the scientific books for the study of gender studies and, medical textbooks on how to do gender affirmation surgeries. Those are the books that you see Nazis burning. But that's often not taught unless you're going deeper into the details. If you're just in a high school history class, you're just taught that they burned books and not which ones or why. And seeing trans community targeted, vilified again, that's bad history to see rhyming.
So let's recap what we've learned so far. Christian nationalism is not really about faith. It's about power. And it holds that power by marginalizing and subjugating those it deems as others. We also know that just being a Christian does not automatically make you a supporter of Christian nationalism. We can see that those within Christianity who promote social justice and the dignity of all people might just find kindred spirits in human secularists and pagans. And we know that Quakers have been deeply involved in shaping societal change all along. And again, they are not trying to sell you oatmeal. Wow, this episode is shaping up to be even longer than the last. It's not my fault everyone I spoke with had so many interesting things to say. Perhaps, as a bit of a palate cleanser, we could take a brief intermission here. Get up, walk around, visit the snack bar, see if they've got any nachos. I'm a sucker for that hideous, yellow, most certainly not real liquid cheese. Go on, I'll wait. We'll just listen to a little music in the meantime.
With every next step multiplies uncertainty, and every next day could be the last. When every next breath could be the one that kills you, and every next day could be the last. I got no time, there's no way to be ready. I got no time to say hello. I got no time to bitch about the weather or the chaos and corruption. Can't you feel it in the tip of your spine?
All right, are we all back? Let's get settled in and continue. When I was putting this episode together, I really wanted to speak with someone about the impact of historically black churches in the United States. Christian nationalism, see also white Christian nationalism, has traditionally pursued policies that are exclusionary and often just very thinly veiled racist strategies. But if we're talking about how the black church has shaped this country, I'm thinking of the work of abolitionist groups in early America and MLK during the Civil Rights Movement. These faith leaders are using their Christianity to fuel their pursuit of equality and justice. In his article, A Brief History of the Black Church's Diversity and Its Vital Role in American Political History, published in The Conversation, Dr. Jason Oliver Evans gives an account of the complicated relationship between black churches, American history, and politics.
We have to understand that the history of American Christianity must reckon with the slave ship. And so when it comes to the United States, we're thinking about, of course, the paradigmatic number is 1619. We've known this in the last few years with the work of Nicole Hannah-Jones. It's 1619 as the year that you had at least about 20 Africans brought over to what it would be known as colonial Virginia. Specifically when it comes to religion, prior to, let's say, 1706, the colonies were starting to emerge. The Christian presence in the colonies was primarily Anglican. Okay, so the Church of England had their Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, and they had their missions in the colonies during this time. Now, there was much chatter among slaveholders. In fact, there was much suspicion among slaveholders of Anglican priests in their presence, because there was this unsubstantiated rumor that was based in fact, in some sense, that they didn't want Anglican priests on their plantations at all. Because if the enslaved Africans were baptized, under British law, it was supposed that all baptized Christians were to be free. So by extension, they needed to be manumitted as a consequence of their baptism. So slaveholders during this time in the late 1600s want nothing to do with Christianity, or at least the enslaved. Now, the enslaved were also suspicious of these people's presence for a myriad reasons, obviously. And the main reason being they didn't want to hear anything that would legitimate their oppression. So for those who were already primarily practicing their indigenous religions or traditional African religions, they were like, we don't want this. Or they just found the message of this crucified man completely absurd. But of those who were giving an ear to this message, there were two pretty much categories, general categories. They either would modify some of the ideas that they heard from these Christian pastors, and they would adjust it according to their African cosmologies and religious practices and worldview. And then there was the second option, which there are those who did embrace the good news as they received it while rejecting the slaveholding impulses. So African American Christianity arises in these two kind of like tensions, right? The first group, they would either modify, their religious worldview, but didn't accept the full gospel message. And that would arise with like maybe the emergence of hoodoo culture. And you can see this in voodoo culture in New Orleans in later years with the Catholics and so forth. They would modify that. But for those Africans who would hear the good news and accept the kind of like the basic Christian message, they accepted it, but used Jesus as a hermeneutical key to reject any legitimation of their oppression. And so what you have is the emergence of African Christians. At the same time, you also have, by 1706, you have colonial legislatures basically codify that the enslaved, if they become Christian, their Christian identity will have no bearing on their status as a slave. And what you have as a consequence of that is Anglican priests started to create so-called slave catechisms. One French-born Anglican priest, Francis Lejeune, gives an account in colonial South Carolina in writing to his boss in England about his struggle to convert both the Native Americans as well as the enslaved. And then he gives in one of his letters a brief slave catechism, basically saying, if you receive this baptism, let's be clear that you're not going to be free, right? For lack of a better words. And he talks about, I found this to be ironic. He noticed that within the enslaved communities that he was ministering to, that they would, promote polygamy of some kind. And he was like, listen, you got to understand that the Christian faith does not promote polygamy. The irony that I pick up out of this is like the historic reality of slaveholders raping the
Yeah.
enslaved.
Yeah.
So there's this like, what does salvation mean for the enslaved woman? I
Yeah.
raised that in my dissertation. Like, what does sexual propriety and holiness mean for the enslaved? Because there's also records of enslaved men being sexually assaulted by slaveholders as well. So it's like you want them to follow the Christian conventions of marriage, but you don't even recognize their unions. Now, in the 1700s, you have the Second Great Awakening, right? The First Great Awakening was with the Puritans like Cotton Mather, Jonathan Edwards, with their works in mostly the New England period. With the Second Great Awakening, you had this upsurge of the Methodist and Baptist revivals, right? The Second Great Awakening would be attributed to George Whitefield and John Wesley, as well as Charles Wesley. And you have this great revival or like spread of Methodism across the South. But the enslaved, they were more amenable to the revivals of the Methodists as well as the Baptists. So you see the emergence of the enslaved becoming mostly Baptists and Methodists. And you see the earliest independent Black Baptist church, which was in, I believe, in South Carolina in the 1800s. So it's growing among the enslaved. And in the Northeast, you have free Africans also becoming Methodist as well as Baptist, mostly Methodist. So I'm thinking, particularly at the turn of the 19th century, you have the founding of the AME Church through Richard Allen, Absalom Jones. Richard Allen founded the Free African Society, which would later become the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Absalom Jones became, I believe, an Episcopal priest. I believe he was the first African American to become an Episcopal priest in the 1800s. This is all happening in Philadelphia. So the African Methodist Episcopal Church became the first official Black independent Protestant denomination in the United States. And so you see the emergence of these groundswells of African American churches. So when it comes to politics, interestingly enough, African American churches have been a part of the politics of the United States since their inception. I'm thinking of like David Walker, African American activist, intellectual. His work was definitely prominent. Mariah Stewart, who was the first woman in the United States history to give a public address in the 1800s. These are African American Christian people. I'm also thinking of Denmark Vesey, who was an AME minister. He led a slave insurrection or an attempt slave insurrection in South Carolina. Thinking about Nat Turner, who was the enslaved Baptist preacher who led, of course, a very controversial and violent revolt until he was captured, I believe, in 1829, and then eventually executed. So there were about over 200 attempted slave insurrections recorded in the history, and a lot of them were led by preachers. So if you want to talk about politics, like African American Christians were leading slave insurrections, then in the turn of the 20th century, you had folks like Henry McNeil Turner, who was a bishop in the AME Church, who also became a politician during the Reconstruction era. And then I'm thinking in the early 20th century, Ida B. Wells Barnett, the famous journalist who did much of her research on lynchings. She was a Presbyterian. So to be clear, African Americans played a huge role in the shaping of the politics of America. And yet we have to be clear that African American Christianity is not monolithic. There's a diversity of theological orientations, like, of course, various different Protestants. And then there's various different theological sensibilities when it comes to social engagement. In Black church study scholarship and the history of Black religion, there were kind of generally two camps that sociologists would name. When it came to the more evangelical leaning pietistic camp, they would call compensatory. Compensatory usually were those who said, I mean, to put it crudely, the world is fallen. And so we preach a gospel of repentance and that God will come by in the sweet by and by and make this right. Now, that's, of course, a general caricaturization, but it fits their sensibility. It's like they had a more, I wouldn't use the term conservative. I would say more traditionalist, more pietistic, more personal. Salvation is personal. It's not that they didn't believe that racism was sinful. They just believed that God will remedy this in God's own good time. So we cultivate a Christian piety that says, you know, we're living right in this earth until Jesus is soon to come, and so forth. Then there is also among African Americans what is called a constructivist account, saying, yes, the structures of this world are sinful, and yet we are responsible for changing it. So I'm thinking of Henry McNeill Turner becoming actively involved in the politics of America. And he was deeply, like, according to Andre Johnson's work, he was deeply pessimistic about, if you think about the American nation.
Yeah.
Very pessimistic.
I mean, I get it. I get
And yet
it.
he became a politician to, serve in Congress and to, fight for the rights of African Americans during the Reconstruction era. Despite his deep pessimism, in fact, actually, his pessimism had room for him saying, I'm going to take care of our people and do what we can. And Martin Luther King would fall within this largely constructivist account of Black religion that says, God has made us responsible for the world in which we live in, and so we're going to work like hell to change it. And he himself would say much of his theology in his early years was shaped by theological liberals, white liberals. Prior to that, he had a deep suspicion of his father's alleged fundamentalism. He said his father was deeply fundamental. He learned from his father, however, how to be socially engaging. So this is where the kind of like taxonomy of fundamentalism breaks down, because his father, although had a fundamentalist theology, according to King, his father was actively involved in the NAACP and fighting to change the laws for the betterment of African Americans and have equal rights. So his father belonged to a Black social gospel tradition. And the Black social gospel had ideas that were very similar to the predominantly white social gospel movement. In the South, in Atlanta, Martin Luther King's father, Martin Luther King Sr., and his maternal grandfather, A.D. Williams, were deeply committed to Black social gospel. So they had conservative theological beliefs, and they had their piety, and yet they believed that God has called them to change this world and to make it right and make it equal. So that's where these like compensatory and constructivists break down, because Martin Luther King was rooted within what Lewis Baldwin calls an Ebenezer tradition. So Ebenezer Baptist Church, where his maternal grandfather pastored, and then he and his father pastored. They were deeply rooted in an evangelical piety that was socially engaged. So it's wild because, of course, for folks, when you hear the term evangelical, socially engaged, what, for like social equality? That is not known for that. But this is where like the exceptions come, right? So I say all this to say that like African-American Christianity has various different postures when it comes to politics. And over time, I think even despite the theological diversity, African-American Christians have been forced by the conditions to engage. Now, there are different kinds of engagement, of course. For example, Martin Luther King, back in the early 1960s, in the late 1950s, he got in the crosshairs of one Joseph H. Jackson, who was the then president of the National Baptist Convention. And Joseph H. Jackson was a powerful, influential leader who, when it came to matters of civil rights, was a gradualist. Gradualism was the posture of many African-American Christian leaders who were like, it was their position that racism could not be legislated because racism at its heart, at its root, is a sinful matter that must be accounted for. And so their position was, we believe, insofar as we as Black Christians, we follow Jesus Christ in the world, eventually whites will gradually repent of their sin and the laws will change in turn. King opposed that position. He opposed that practically because in the mid-1950s, he was drawn into the fight where you had Claudette Colvin, who refused to give up her seat. May she rest in peace. She recently passed away. And then later Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat. So we're talking about the Montgomery bus boycott. So he was already drawn in, and he was the de facto leader of that movement. And so he got in the crosshairs of a Joseph Jackson. In 1961, there was a huge fight within the National Baptist Convention, which led to a split. And the split was when certain Baptist luminaries within that denomination sided with King, and it led to the founding of the Progressive National Baptist Convention. So Black Baptists were deeply divided over the matter of how do we deal with civil rights. All this to say, like African Americans since then, you can see that there are divisions within African American Christianity when it comes to politics and political engagement.
In such tumultuous times, perhaps a bit of meditation and self-reflection is in order. Buddhism is practiced by roughly 320 million people worldwide, with about 3.5 million of those practitioners residing in the US. Founded in India around the 5th century BCE, Buddhism is a non-theistic philosophy focusing on achieving enlightenment, nirvana, and ending the cycle of rebirth, though specific traditions and practices vary by region. For insight into Western Buddhism, I spoke with the director of Kansas City's Temple Buddhist Center, Victor Doherty.
There are quite a few stories within the Buddhist circles about times when reporters and journalists and things would ask the Dalai Lama or a Zen master, it's like, hey, for our readers, can you just boil Buddhism down to like 6 words? Well, no problem. 3,000 years of practice and study, no problem. But of course, being who they are, they were able to do it. So there's no reason for me to have to come up with something I can just share with you. For example, when a Zen master was asked, what is the deepest teaching in Buddhism, in the fewest amount of words, and his response was, after he thought for a moment, he said, doing one thing at a time. And, the deeper teaching and meaning in that, 'cause a lot of people are like, I can brush my teeth, but we're never actually brushing our teeth. We're going through the motions of brushing our teeth while our mind is in 25 different places, and we're going over everything we're going to say at the business meeting tomorrow. So that's one definition of Buddhism is, developing a way of life in which you literally are just doing one thing at a time. The Dalai Lama was asked, again, same question. Could you boil Buddhism down to the fewest words possible? And of course, the Dalai Lama sat there and he thought, and then he responded with shaping intention. So one of the things that I spend a lot of time doing here in the Midwest is teaching about, just basic Buddhism and the way Buddhism is practiced here in the United States, what we now are calling Western Buddhism. It's not a religion. Not in the terms that we would all think of a religion. We're not worshiping anything or anyone. Buddhism is a practice like yoga. It's a way of living your life, a philosophy of living your life. So that's why on Sunday mornings I have people from all kinds of faiths, Islamic faith and from Judaism, Christianity, that attend, because you can be a person of faith and still be a practicing Buddhist. They are not mutually exclusive. So if you asked Victor, what's Buddhism, I think you could almost boil it down to self-awareness and self-discipline. That might be one answer that would come up for me. One of our other teachers here at Temple Buddhist Center likes to say you could boil all of Buddhism down to one phrase, and that phrase is not always so. So whatever it is you're thinking about or talking about, it's not always that way.
Yeah.
And these are all those expansive thoughts. They're just so big that our little minds struggle to get around it.
Yeah, I love that. I was doing some reading and I did see that there was some discussion about, Western Buddhism, and some would argue that it's more psychological and based on sort of mindfulness practice rather than, a religion where we might think you're praising a deity. And that's sort of what you guys have on the Temple Buddhist Center website, is that it's this focus on meditation and mindfulness and things like that.
I mean, you really hit on a very important point, Jamie, and that is, Buddhism, when it comes into a culture or a society, it does not come as a conqueror. It's not here to tell you you're doing everything wrong. It comes in as a pilgrim, and it takes and it accepts the values and the cultural milieu, if you will, and it works through that. So to give you an example, when Buddhism came into Japan, the cultural milieu and the values were very much about self-discipline. There was a rigidity, a single point of focus. And so that's how Zen was born. And Zen is very much like that. So you see, it takes whatever the culture or the value is and it works through that. When Buddhism came to the United States, it found a sister in American psychology, Western psychology. And so what happened was this beautiful union where psychology explained the enigmatic, difficult to understand concepts of Buddhism, like, what's the sound of one hand clapping, all those cliche kinds of things. It took that and it made it understandable to Westerners. It's like, oh my gosh, I totally see what's going on. And then at the same time, Buddhism helped bring out the spiritual aspect of psychology because it's a psychology that we use to purify ourselves of fear, greed, hatred, and delusion, thus revealing our true nature, our Buddha nature, our Christ nature, whatever you want to call it, is revealed. Because see, the Buddha didn't teach happiness and love and joy. The Buddha taught one thing, and that's the cessation of suffering, because what he understood was that we are love, compassion, joy, and peace. We are that, but we don't know it because it's covered over by fear, greed, hatred, and delusion. So when we purify those things, our true nature is revealed.
Have you faced any challenges as a Buddhist in a Midwestern, sometimes predominantly Christian or Bible Belt setting, as it were?
Oh my, yes, yeah, quite a bit. Everything from, for example, in trying to bring meditation, mindfulness practices, calming, centering, and grounding kinds of practices into prisons, which is a population that it's heartbreaking that they're not able to have access to this kind of stuff. And what I run into is oftentimes the chaplain at the prison is of Christian origin because that's what was able to get into the prisons, and for a long time, that's all there was, right? For hundreds of years, that's all there was. Unfortunately, they seem to be somewhat proprietary over prisons now. And so inmates who want to know about Islam or they want to know about Judaism or they want to know about Buddhism, I'm not able to get any books, magazines, and it's very difficult to even be able to go there and teach meditation. So that's something I've run into. The other thing that I run into is all of the myths about Buddhism. A lot of folks, especially here in the Midwest, I mean, the coasts, right? They're filled with tremendous organizations, groups, monasteries, universities that are absolutely embracing Buddhism. But here in the Midwest, like you were saying, being kind of the Bible Belt area, I run into a lot of idiosyncrasies and stereotypes and things like that. And just plain ignorance. People just simply don't know. They think Buddhism is a cult. They always hear the first noble truth of Buddhism is that life is suffering. And they always hear that and they're stop. You guys sound like a barrel of laughs already. I don't want anything to do with it. And they don't understand that the first noble truth is not a mandate.
Yeah.
It's an observation.
I did like too that, and I think it's important to note, speaking of maybe assumptions that are made about Buddhism, that it's in the same way that Christianity has many denominations and is varied. There's variation in types of Buddhisms. And just as you said before, the way that it's moved into different spaces and cultures and countries has sort of affected how it's grown. It's this symbiotic relationship.
I love that. That's a good way to put it.
What I'm exploring in this episode particularly is Christian nationalism, which is the exact opposite of that. Christian nationalism seeks to conform everything to fit in the path and is unwilling sort of to grow and change.
Honestly, Christian nationalism, one of the things that I teach here at Temple Buddhist Center is that anything that divides or separates us is not spiritual. And so you can call yourself anything you want, but if you're separating and dividing human beings, then we know what it's not. It's not spiritual because, that's not a concept in spirituality that any of them adhere to. So it would be political. It would be, religion is often used as the sword of politics, but we don't even need to go into the denomination, right? Because one of my teachers used to say, your religion is what you do when no one's looking. It's that, where are you spending your time? The Buddha said that as a person thinks, so they become. So you become your thoughts in the same way that you become the food that you ate. We're consumers. And so, coming back to Christian nationalism, I actually consider less the denomination and understand more that this is not a spiritual movement or anything like that. It's truly a movement that's based on fear. And then the action arm of fear is hatred. So one can be afraid, but only until, anger really kicks in and hatred are you able to do and say terrible things about other human beings, to categorize them, to label them, all the things that you see happening. So I think the first thing to understand is that, number one, this is not a spiritual movement. I guess they classify themselves as religion. I'm not sure I necessarily agree with that, but I guess one thing we could say is that religion needs spirituality, but spirituality does not need religion. And so what you have here is people who are very, very afraid, and their fear has turned into hatred and anger because that feels better than fear. Nobody wants to feel fear. They'd rather feel hatred and anger because those are much more powerful feelings. I can really do something with that now. So they would rather feel that. So that's what's happening. It's just more fear and anger and hatred. They just happen to cloak it as something called Christian nationalism, whatever. What we all know, because all of us have been in America long enough to know that none of the stuff they're talking about was ever taught by Jesus and the Bible. So I don't know what or who they are.
Yeah. How do you think that Buddhism or the Temple Buddhist Center can help with some of the issues maybe that the United States is facing right now? Do you think there's a place for Buddhism in those talks and in helping with those issues?
Yes, yes, absolutely. And we can start right there. In other words, one of the things that we teach is that we help the members of our community understand that everybody gives in a way that they can. So our egoic mind often says, well, writing a check for $10 and saying it there is just not doing anything, and that's not true. That's just an egoic story that your mind is making up because it's coming from a place of lack. And so one of the things we teach is that everybody gives in a way that they can. So some people may march at a rally. Some people may start a letter campaign. Some people might work a political campaign for somebody who is more kind and compassionate towards our marginalized communities. So it's first and foremost, we must understand that everybody gives in the best way that they can. And so we never judge how anybody gives. And one of the things I teach is, for some of us, the best we can do is to purify fear and greed and hatred and delusion within our own bodies so that we are radiating love, kindness, and compassion. For some of us, that's the best they can do. And you know what? That's a lot because most people right now, what they're radiating is fear, anger, and hatred. There's bad people that need to be punished for what they're doing. And when you look at it on the quote, I'm doing air quotes. I know your
Yeah.
listeners can't see that, but when you look at the other side, which is it's an illusion, there's not another side, but they're saying the same thing, right? I hate you guys because you want to give all of our money away and blah, 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 right? Whatever, insert whatever topic or argument point that you want to. So we teach that everybody gives the best they can. We teach that whatever you do, because within Buddhism, it's not what you do. It's the quality of the doing that is important. So if my intention is to show these darn crazy, Republicans or conservatives or whatever, liberals and whatever that's just hatred. And so if you come from a place of hatred, then you are putting more hatred out there in the world, and that's going to come back. You're not helping at all. Even if I'm screaming, yelling, raising my hands, you're actually not helping, and it's considered unskillful. So for Buddhism, we want to make sure that people purify their intentions so that when you do take action, if you march because your heart has moved you to do so, not because you want to put the bad people in their place or plot the demise of this group standing across the street. That's not helping anything at all. And so those are how we can give back. We don't have money like many of the other larger traditions in the Kansas City area. They have the ability to, literally build a homeless shelter and stock it with food. We can't do that. We're very small in that way. And so we teach our community members how to cope, how to have resilience, and how to participate in this process of change right now, but from a place of love, understanding, and compassion. And please don't get me wrong, and I don't want your listeners to get me wrong. We can be fierce in standing up for justice, in standing up for equality, for standing up for basic rights such as food and healthcare. We can be fierce in doing so, but we're not hateful. That's an illusion that says I have to be angry and hateful to be effective. No, you don't.
On February 10th of this year, 19 Buddhist monks completed a 2,300-mile, 108-day walk for peace from Texas to Washington, D.C., with the goal of promoting peace, compassion, and mindfulness amidst political divisions. In January, at least 100 clergy were arrested at Minnesota's largest airport during an anti-ICE demonstration. In Maine, religious leaders have been standing outside a business targeted by ICE to protect its immigrant workers. Across the nation, we see faith communities working in direct opposition to Christian nationalism. To better understand the complexities of Christianity versus Christian nationalism, I returned to Dr. Jason Oliver Evans.
Honestly, what we're seeing is people using the name of Christ, using the tradition to legitimate so much evil, which honestly is on brand. If we think about historically, in America, this is on brand. Using the Bible, using the tradition to uphold slaveocracy, to uphold segregation, to uphold all these racist notions and why God made all the different races and made whites superior and so forth. This is not new. It's the same thing, just rewrapped and rehearsed and reverbed, and has technology and has social media and has reach. It's not new. This impulse to do this is not new. And quite frankly, it's actually not new if we actually have a robust understanding of, or at least literacy of the Bible. Because Jesus says this, they honor me with their lips, but their heart's far from me. And he's quoting from the Hebrew Bible. So it's this is what it means to use God's name in vain.
Yeah.
So there's an impulse within humanity to actually do this, and it's consistent. Sometimes I'm like, can we have a new language in order to totally distinguish between this? But honestly, that's what makes it difficult, because of the language game, so to speak, and the structure. You use the same language, and yet we're talking about two distinct realities, if we will. Is there a reality that legitimates harm and oppression and evil, or a reality that fosters the good and welfare and peace of all people? And yet we're using the same language. So how do we distinguish between the two? This is where it is important for us as a culture, American culture, and especially in this critical time, to be more educated, to foster more literacy, to foster more reading, to foster more critical thinking, to foster more intellectual curiosity. What I fear as a reaction of faith deconstructionism is you can't fight Christian supremacy by being ignorant of Christian faith. You can't fight Christian supremacy. You can't fight Christian nationalism if you do not know the theological tradition. Because a lot of people think because they know the evangelicalism in which they were raised, they know the Christian tradition. No. I'm like, no. So your reaction is just well, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. Well, tell me what's right. show the other way. What is actually the other way? What is more faithful to Jesus of Nazareth? What is more faithful to the good news? What does it mean to be truly church? What does it mean to be truly a loving community? Yes, part of it is your ethics, treating everybody right, doing unto others as you have them do. But people want to know more beyond the baseline because you have people who are believing that they are doing right by supporting ICE, that they're doing right by supporting the current administration and these policies to discriminate against LGBTQIA people and to literally turn back the civil rights legislation. When the president literally gets up and says that as a consequence of the Civil Rights Act, white men are being discriminated against, that's a failure of our education system. I mean, the whole independent Christian homeschool movement was in reaction to integration anyway in public education. So it's like literally people, we have this current administration, we have the way that we do because we have a culture that fosters ignorance, that fosters a resistance against learning. It's truly an anti-intellectual culture that unfortunately exists within Black churches. So we're not exempt from anti-intellectualism. In fact, it actually contributes to a lot of this conservative reaction and rise within African-American Christianity against. Now you have Black Christians saying that Martin Luther King wasn't Christian. What? He wasn't Christian because of his theological liberalisms in his early years. Like, you literally openly saying this and using fundamentalist metrics as litmus tests for what it means to be Christian. But these are the same fundamentalist litmus tests that literally by default to be Black and Christian already is nonsensical from a fundamentalist logic because it's inherently racist. So it's like, what are we doing? We're promoting and regurgitating ideas and values that are not our own because we don't actually follow the historical, cultural, contextual arising of these mindsets. And for those of us who are thoroughly educated in understanding, or at least have a basic grammar for understanding how these ideas generate, we have to be more responsible to help our people understand in our communities how to discern the truth from the lie. Because, and this is a powerful quote, Christopher Morse, who is a systematic theologian years ago, wrote this book, Not Every Spirit, which is his basic systematic theology introductory text. And he quotes from Leo Tolstoy. And Tolstoy has this powerful perspective about Christianity. And to paraphrase him, he says, I would believe this, but I find that the truth harbors a lie whenever I encounter said doctrine. And so he says it is my responsibility to basically flesh that out. So in turn, Morris draws on Tolstoy to argue that it is the task of Christians in general, but most acutely Christian theologians, to flesh out the lies that are literally travel under the truth. What does that mean? Even when you believe in something that we're all created in God's image and likeness, the lie that travels under that is the assumption that only white people are created in God's image. So we have to literally say what we affirm and at the same time say what we deny. Because of what's happening here is that a lot of people are saying a lot about what they affirm, but what they affirm carries within it ideologies that are literally false. And in consequence, support policies that promote this falsehood by denying people their rights, denying their agency, denying their freedoms. Literally looking at the laws on the books and totally disregarding the laws on the books. Because what's happening in our culture right now, what's happening in the United States with ICE, they're literally doing illegal stuff. And you're having people literally looking at the law. Mind you, these are supposed to be conservatives, looking at the law, talk about law-abiding citizens, and yet they are supporting institutions that are denying people their rights and literally engaging in practices that are totally against the law. So something within their faith tradition is harboring so much lies. But this is on brand in the history of America, right? That people could literally go to church every Sunday. Mind you, this was 70 years ago. This was 80 years ago. This was 90 years ago. People would go to church on Sunday, and then during their picnics, they would go to a lynching. It's a deep discrepancy. Because how can you say, to quote a Bible, how can you say you love God and hate your neighbor at the same time?
Don't come around here anymore.
With data collected from the 2017 Baylor Religion Survey, Andrew Whitehead and Samuel Perry were able to identify 4 variations in Americans' orientations toward Christian nationalism. They run from least supportive, called rejectors, to most supportive, called ambassadors, with resistors and accommodators landing in the middle, respectively. At the time, ambassadors for Christian nationalism made up only 19.8%, the smallest group of survey participants, meaning that at least 80% of those polled opposed Christian nationalism in some way. The data confirms that strident champions of Christian nationalism are a minority, a very loud and unruly minority, but a minority just the same. With these figures in mind, I asked Dr. Andrew Whitehead what he thought the path forward might look like for the United States.
I don't know that I have the easy solve. I'm sure there isn't one. But I do still believe that resistors and accommodators, that middle group, but especially accommodators, when we interviewed them for this book, and even since then, when we look at the people in that kind of group, a lot of times they really are still supportive of this idea of religious diversity and racial and ethnic diversity, pluralism, the right of all people of different faiths or no faith at all to be able to participate. But they generally are accommodating of this idea that, well, if one religion is going to be elevated, it might as well be Christianity. But a lot of times when they are then exposed to or can kind of see, well, this is the type of Christianity that comes with it. And when they start to look at some of the policy desires of ambassadors or that group, they a lot of times are uncomfortable with that and disagree with that. It's just that language of Christianity obscures a lot of it. And so maybe they don't even willingly go along, but they don't oppose it, right? And if you're silent, it kind of takes you with it. And so I think that's some of what we're seeing. And so I think going forward, truly, for a democracy to function, it is about political power and political will. And so for folks that want to defend democracy and have America be a pluralistic democratic society, it actually is going to take effort. It isn't something that just exists. And so we have to not just vote, but defend the right for minority groups and those that, have barriers placed in front of them to vote, defending their right to vote. But I think even more so being involved in our communities and civic organizations, because in an authoritarian society, the desire is to kind of crush hope so that you don't really get involved anywhere. But the more that Americans are civically involved, whether it's in your school systems or in your communities or even at the state level, being civically active creates a strong civil society. And that is one of the key parts of a functioning democracy. And so it's kind of like a muscle we just have to use if we want it. If we don't use it, we lose it. And that's kind of where we are now. And so Christian nationalism is a strong cultural framework that really undergirds a lot of this. But the more that we see folks speaking out against that, but especially Christians who from kind of their faith position are able to say, like, I'm Christian, but I disagree with this because of my religious faith, it helps signal that it's not all Christians, or it's not just the Christian way that is this Christian nationalist direction, but that you can be Christian and pro-social and want to provide SNAP benefits for poor people or whatever else. This can come from the dictates of your faith. So really being that voice and then defending the right for others to speak into the civil space, I think, is key. So there's a lot of different angles to that, but I think those are some of what I see as really important as we kind of enter into this new era, because it really is a new era of America and American politics.
If you've watched the news lately or got caught in a doom scroll online, you may, like me, find yourself wondering what can possibly be done. How does one even begin to help? Isn't it all just hopeless? But it seems the answer is much more simple than we might have thought. Collaboration between the faithful, no matter what type, and the non-religious alike. While conducting interviews for this episode, I kept hearing the same refrain. We are a small group. We don't have the resources of a larger church. And certainly, we can't all be Joel Osteen's Lakewood Church generating $80 to $90 million annually. But no man is an island. You are not alone. If we aim to push back against an oppressive authoritarian regime, we need to set aside our trivial differences and focus instead on our common goal: Whether you call yourself a Buddhist, a Quaker, a Baptist, a pagan, a human secularist, or any other of the many faith traditions that it is your right and your prerogative to practice, if you are committed to dignity and equality for all those living on this earth, then I will call you a friend. Well, I think we've finally done it. We solved the damn thing. Nice and tidy. That wasn't so hard now, was it? Since we're already basking in the afterglow of this victory, why don't we try for another? Let's end with an easy breezy softball of a question. Nice and light. I asked a few of our guests today, what is the meaning of life?
Isn't it 42? I thought it was 42.
I always say that.
That's what the book said. And of course, I'm joking around with you because for all of our listeners who have ever read The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, then they'll recognize that. But, from the Buddhist perspective, the opposite of death is not life. The opposite of death is birth. Life is eternal, and you don't have a life. If you had a life, then you'd have something to defend, something to protect, something to worry about, right? You don't have a life. You are life. And so therefore you are eternal as well. So the meaning of life, honestly, I don't want this to sound strange or odd. Yeah, I would encourage people to read more about Buddhism, but the meaning of life is that there is no meaning. Life is this beautiful unfolding process of creation and destruction and different forms coming out of different atoms and then being imbued with consciousness. And this is a symphony that's forever playing. And all of us are just a beautiful note in that grand cosmic symphony. And we always get our times to play different parts of the song, So there's no meaning that we need to attach. That's an egoic structure of the human brain. The human brain tries to attach meaning to everything. And some things, is there a meaning to the sound of a baby's laughter? Is there meaning to a sunset? It's just something to experience and let it open your heart.
It's not a Quaker saying, but it's a saying I think works very well for Quakers, and that's live simply so others can simply live.
The meaning of life is caring for one another and caring for the world.
I don't know, and I'm okay not knowing. But I think a piece of it is about being here to learn and experience things and try to leave it a little better than you found it.
Boy, have we learned and experienced today. In fact, one of the main goals of this podcast is not only to demonstrate just how much I don't know, but also to further seek those answers. There's no shame in admitting knowledge you haven't yet acquired. There's only shame in refusing to learn and grow. For contributing to my education, I'd like to thank today's guests, Andrew Whitehead, Jason Oliver Evans, Julie Samuel Lambert, Jack Nemeth, Victor Doherty, Karis Boukelos, and Susie Matthews. Sound effects for today's show came from freesound.org, and music is from ccmixter.org. A list of full credits is available on my website, unwisepodcast.com. If you've got a story you'd like me to explore, or you'd like to send me a haiku that my melodious voice has inspired you to write, you can find me at unwisepod on Instagram, or email me at beunwise@gmail.com. That's beunwise@gmail.com. For the Unwise Podcast, I'm Jamie Walsh, reminding you to question authority, believe your own eyes, and stay safe, my friendly dissidents. The world needs you.
J'étais incapable de rêver. Au début, c'était un choix. Quand je rêvais, c'était de lui ou alors...
Before you leave, let's return to the multipurpose room of that Unitarian church. The pagan ritual is about to begin. There is some discussion about whether or not the front door is locked, and murmurs to check it to make sure that we're not at risk of someone rushing in with a gun. A truly American sentiment, to be sure. A soft-spoken druid named Stephen guides the group. We go around the room and introduce ourselves. Most seem familiar with one another. I believe just myself and one other woman appear to be newcomers. We're asked to share how we've been feeling and what guidance we may be seeking from tonight's ritual and divination. To my Christian ears, these seem like prayer requests. As I feared, I am asked to speak in front of a group. A part of me thinks I should just call this whole experiment, run out the door, never look back. But they've all seen me. My hurried exit would not go unnoticed. Alas, my Midwestern sensibilities tell me I shouldn't be rude. I introduce myself and tell them I'm feeling anxious and seeking to find connection. Everyone here seems so open. They share in more detail about struggles they've been facing in their personal lives. This is surely the same sense of community I felt in my church growing up. We gather elements of fire, water, earth, and air. A figure of Hecate, the triple-faced Greek goddess of magic and crossroads, is placed on the altar. The torches she carries represent her ability to guide through darkness and to open new paths. An intriguing idea given the quest I've set myself on. A circle is cast. We're then broken into smaller groups to take the struggles we've brought with us and seek guidance from tarot decks. I, who have never once practiced divination of any sort, have borrowed a tarot deck from the community box. A kind man named Daniel, who has brought his own tarot deck that he designed and printed, helps me with my reading. My cards speak to needing to go out and exchange energy and connection with the community and seek answers. Again, an idea not lost on me. A woman named Kat compliments my hair and asks how many tarot readings I've done before. When I tell her this is my first, she explains the importance of divination and seeking guidance. After our readings, Stephen brings the group back together to ground ourselves and chant. We fuel our fire. We bury the bad. We recreate what we need.
With every next breath, with every new contaminant, when every next day could be the last, I'm supposed to feel alive. I'm supposed to be productive. I'm supposed to feel alive. I'm supposed to be productive.